Hi, everybody. Welcome to the latest Series 3, Episode 1 of Return of the Hack podcast from E92 Plus. I'm your host, Neil Langridge. I'm delighted today to be joined by Beth, who's the editor at Infosecurity Magazine. So we're going to be looking at some big cybersecurity topics from a slightly different angle, not so much just from the technology, but especially from the media and how organizations and all of us as a community respond. So hi, Beth. Thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to share my view on how we deal with cybersecurity in the news.
Perfect. So if you want to give us a just a little bit of background about your role at the magazine and kind of what it encompasses.
Yep, so I am the editor for Infosecurity Magazine, as you mentioned. So I oversee all the content that is published on our website, as well as curating the agenda for our online summits, which happen twice a year. So those are 2-day virtual events. I work with the team on our webinars as well. And I also work closely with the Infosecurity Europe team. So the two brands are kind of aligned in partnership and provide information to them, especially on the conference agenda. So involved in a bit of everything, but making sure we keep our fingers on the pulse in terms of what's going on in the cybersecurity world.
Yeah, so obviously that encompasses the big topics and the trends as well as the breaking news because obviously, I think we all know this stuff happens, kind of quite regularly, and obviously kind of hits the, should we say, hits the consumer media now as well. So I suppose it'd be nice to kind of, at the start, to take a snapshot in terms of kind of where you see kind of the cybersecurity in terms of the media at the moment, and in terms of kind of, what those kind of bigger trends are that you're seeing and hearing about.
Yeah, so I mean, cybersecurity itself is a huge growth market. We see it as a growth market, despite economic challenges in the last 12 to 18 months. It continues to be a market that's growing. So it is increasing in importance, and it's interesting. You kind of point out it's filtering into the mainstream media more than probably ever before. I think one thing we're seeing in terms of how the media cover it is when there is a big breach, everyone is all over it. So some really good examples this year, which especially in the UK, you would have seen on the 6 o'clock news, the Royal Mail incident that was covered quite largely on the mainstream media, as well as I think the 23andMe issue in the US, which we'll definitely get onto. That's been one that's kind of filtered into the mainstream media. So we're seeing these incidents getting coverage front and center in people's living rooms, really. But for us, obviously, we've been around for a long time, a couple of decades, I think now. So since cybersecurity's infancy. So in terms of the trends we're seeing in that kind of deeper, what people are talking about within the industry, not just talking to the general public. I kind of made a bit of a list because we've just come out of our kind of predictions weeks or months. So around November, we'll start getting emails from a lot of vendors saying this is what we think is going to happen, or these are the hot topics we're thinking are going to be talked about in 2024. Obviously, sometimes with the vendors, you have to take it with a bit of a pinch of salt, because if it's an email security vendor, for example, they're going to probably think email security is a hot topic. But I have broken it down into things that we're kind of talking about overall. And obviously AI is a big one. And that's an interesting one because that's also, it hit the mainstream media like mad. What's interesting for us, though, at Infosecurity Magazine is making sure that what we write about in terms of AI is relevant to cybersecurity, because it is a really broad topic. So with the cybersecurity industry, it's really thinking about how does it affect cybersecurity, how does it affect organizational security, what tools are being used. And I think a lot of cybersecurity professionals still have a lot of questions around that. So that's a really big one. We're definitely seeing the law enforcement cases. So Quackbot, that was a big one last year, where their malware infrastructure was taken down by FBI and an international coalition of partners. Again, that's something that enters the mainstream media quite a lot as well, because it's quite a big, shiny, interesting story, like law enforcement takes down cyber criminals. What we do, though, is we dig into it a little bit more. What does that actually mean? We'll talk to threat analysts for various companies and say, well, Are they actually gone? Will this evolve? And dig into that a little bit more. The third trend that we're also seeing is regulation. That's not necessarily as like interesting and sexy, I guess,
No.
as the FBI getting involved and taking down cyber criminals. But for cybersecurity professionals, NIST, the SEC changes in the US as well, they are hot topics, and they are people are really talking about those. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that sometimes the more interesting like threat analyst stuff and advanced persistent threats and nation states and all that, that can be really interesting and really great to write about. But some of the most basic issues are what are causing the big breaches. Bad passwords, it's a thing. It continues to be a thing. And social engineering and phishing. So while we sometimes in the media really want to get our teeth stuck into these like really like crazy ways of hacking into an organization, actually it's probably going to be a phishing email that someone clicks on. That is still the main pathway to entry for cyber criminals. So those are a few things that I think are hot topics for us, but also you can see how they infiltrate into the mainstream media as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance, isn't it? Because, as you say, you also want to write about the kind of really interesting stuff and the fascination. But I suppose it's kind of like, it is that kind of Groundhog Day when, you look at the stats in terms of where the largest amount of cybercrime revenues come from. And it's fraud, it's social engineering, it's business email compromise, which is the kind of the same sort of stuff. And as you say, it's a cyber fundamental that I suppose kind of collectively as an industry we've definitely not fixed yet. And it's the same sort of stuff pretty regularly.
Yeah, and it's the thing that organizations, and when we speak to senior cyber security leaders, it's what they're grappling with the most,
Yeah.
that education and awareness of their own employees, to make sure that they are up to date with the latest social engineering tactics. And what's interesting is it's not just those phishing emails coming into your work inbox, it's also through social media as
Yeah.
well. So organizations are thinking, well, I can protect my emails, but I can't necessarily protect what Joe Blogs does on his social media account. And if cyber criminals know that Joe Blogs works at X company, then that can be an issue. So that's kind of how it's evolving. And obviously, we always talk about how it's getting, excuse me, more and more sophisticated, which it really is. It is, I think, it is a game of cat and mouse. I know that's something that is often said, but it truly is, yeah.
And a kind of interesting kind of kind of off on a bit of a tangent, but we talked kind of touched on that kind of consumer awareness and becoming headlines on the BBC News or the Guardian or what have you. But I suppose is that, I mean, it's a good thing in terms of, obviously it's a bad thing in terms of consumers more being targeted. And obviously during COVID we all had that rise in phishing emails of you've got to click on for your vaccine or delivery notice on your door for Prime or whatever it happens to be. But actually, are you seeing that increase in level of consumer awareness and understanding, kind of really having an impact in terms of how organizations are approaching it? Or, is it a benefit? Are we all more collectively educated, or is it the fact that we're just, kind of we're hit with so much and it is getting more complex and varied that actually, we all know more, but we're actually not any further forward because of that? Because at the end of the day, we're all at work, we're at work now, but we're also still people, and we're the same people that will go home and then kind of click on stuff at home or deal with our relatives who've clicked on something. Is that helping that kind of broader consumer level of awareness of like what cybersecurity involves?
I think we're probably more aware than we ever have been, and that will continue. And what I think is quite interesting is maybe it's because we are really plugged in, so it becomes a little bit more like, it's like if you're thinking about someone in a red hat, you'll see red hats everywhere. But what I find interesting is when I like click onto the news, or even if I'm scrolling through social media, cybersecurity stuff will come up. A recent one actually that I've seen a couple of times is I think his name's Anthony Cohen. He's a big presenter in the US, and he was hit by uh, cybercrime relating to his banking, and he
Oh,
went
right.
on a show and talked about what actually happened. And I think the more that happens, where you've got celebrities or people that are well known say, hey, this happened to me, it could happen to anyone, that's got to be a good thing. And I think that's probably something you wouldn't have seen a few years ago. In terms of organisations' approaches as well to this education piece, what I think is quite interesting, and I've heard it from a couple of senior people in the cybersecurity world from the end user side, is in terms of education, it's good for them not to just approach it by you need to protect the
Yeah.
business. If they can say, well, you need to protect your family, so you
Yeah.
need, this is how you could be scammed and lose personal money, not just our business money. So educating them about online scams around the holidays, or how phishing attempts are coming through text and social media and stuff, and saying this is a toolkit you can use in your personal life as well. I think that's where I get the feedback that they're seeing success in that education piece. So it's not just about, well, we need to protect the business. No, we need to protect you as a person, because actually that could impact the business one day. But also it means that you're going home to your family and saying, well, hey, let's just check out that text before you do click on it, and like thinking twice and making it more of a everyday thought, rather than just okay, 9 to 5, I've got to kind of think about this, but it's not a priority. So I think it is filtering in from a multiple different angles into people's everyday psyche. And I think the fact that pretty much everyone knows about the delivery scams now, like
Yeah.
the text, like Royal Mail, but it's royal.mayle or whatever
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think some of those, because they've been so prominent in the news and just in general conversation, that education piece is getting better, but I wouldn't say it's like we're there and everyone knows. Obviously, there's
No.
still a lot of work to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, we're definitely not there yet. And I suppose that's also in terms of, kind of maybe as we start coming on to how organizations do respond to attacks, and then, when yourselves kind of get involved, are we beginning to see it, you're seeing interaction with departments outside of just cybersecurity. So, it covers operations, it covers finance, it covers obviously senior C-level leadership, that because there's that greater level of understanding, they kind of can buy in more to what needs to be done from an infosecurity perspective, because there is that better understanding of what this actually is, rather than the IT crowd being in the basement and they're the IT people and we'll just stay away from them. I think everybody understands it a bit better, so hopefully that can kind of help drive more executive engagement.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, one of the things we talk a lot about with CISOs that we engage with is how to not make things over technical and over complicated,
Yeah.
to really use communication as a tool in your arsenal to get the message across about these cyber threats. Because once people hear it in their language, they're more likely to adopt good practices. Whereas if they hear it in either scary language or technical language, it just kind of goes over people's heads. I mean, I think a lot of people would admit that they are not technical experts, even if they do sit within cybersecurity. So having common language with people is really important. And it's something we hear from senior leadership within cyber all the time, is about how do I best engage people that are not within the
Yeah.
cybersecurity world to be able to get my message across and protect my business.
Yeah, it's a kind of one thing I didn't touch on later, but yeah, kind of we'll raise it now in terms of that balance between positivity and negativity. As a cybersecurity marketer myself, I'm very conscious of not wanting to focus on FUD, fear, uncertainty,
Yeah.
tout a negative message, but you're all going to get hacked by our stuff. That's really, really important. And I suppose that, kind of similarly with yourselves, the reality is, I think we know this, we might not like it, but bad news sells newspapers. Kind of like the scary headline for you, from your perspective, drives clicks. But there is that balance of not wanting to just be very negative, and not, as well as that, not wanting to make it very technical. I suppose. How do you approach finding that right balance? Because it's not tricky in terms of doing the right thing as well as driving more engagement and readership.
Yeah, so it's it is a balancing act, and I think this goes for any journalism, not just within our industry.
Yeah.
I was listening to another podcast earlier today, and a journalist was talking about how she gets rated on her columns that she writes, and she's got to think of stuff that will get clicks. But if enough stuff gets clicks, then you can start writing about the stuff you're more passionate about as well to balance it out. So there's a little bit of that. In terms of how I like to approach things is, I think the Royal Mail cyber attack last year is a good example, because it was quite an ongoing story. It was a big story. So we were competing with the BBC and the Guardian, who are also covering it. But obviously we've got a specific audience. So we like to cover the initial what's happened, so people can get that click, like, okay, what has actually happened? And then I like to dive into the so what. Okay, so what does it mean for our audience? Maybe explain some of the elements of the incident, give a bit of guidance. Obviously, we often get comment from vendors saying, "Well, if they had done this," so we're careful with, we try and be careful with what we pick out of that, because sometimes it'll be, again, if we talk about an email security vendor, they might say, well, if they had this kind of email security, this might have not happened. And sometimes it's like, well, it kind of would have happened anyway. So it's really diving into that. So what? So yes, you might have hopefully not too scary a headline, but something that makes people click. But hopefully we provide a lot of additional information about the incident, what it actually means for you as a cybersecurity professional, what the fallout is, what lessons can be learned from it. So it's taking that deeper dive rather than just being like, this big scary thing happened. Okay, great. What do I do as a cybersecurity professional? What do I do with that information? So we try and add a little bit more to it as the story goes on as well. And that's something we're definitely going to do more of this year. So I work with a great team of journalists. So James Coker, who's my deputy editor, and Kevin Poirot, who's our news reporter. And we talk all the time about, okay, this big incident has happened, but what can we add? What value can we add to not necessarily make more people click, but people to stay on the page and read the information that we want to get across to people? So that's where we're trying to avoid just being FUD and scary and that kind of thing. But it is a balancing act, because success doesn't really sell. Like, oh great, this company hasn't ever been breached. Like no one's going to click on that. And I think it's an issue that the cybersecurity industry has as a whole, is we do focus on the negative a lot and don't champion our successes. So if anyone listening wants to share like a success with me, I'm more than happy to have that conversation. Well, in terms of successes though, one thing we have been doing and I've been driving is interviews with CISOs to say, tell us something that you have implemented that's worked well for others to learn from, and these might not be the stories that get 100,000 clicks or whatever, but I think they're really valuable in getting CISOs to share the accomplishments that they've had, whether it's implementing a new way of doing things, a new recruitment strategy, because skills and that recruitment gap is still huge and a huge issue, but sharing those successes. And we try and, especially in our conference programs, try and make sure we're not just fear. We're actually sharing practical advice that people can take away and think, okay, I'm going in the right direction, or I can learn from that. Like, it's not just about the news, like this is what happened, it's can I learn something from this?
Yeah, and I think that kind of collaboration is, I think, something as an industry that we could actually do better. And I don't just mean necessarily from the CISO, because I think the CISO community probably do that. But I'd say us in terms of the channel and vendors, because it is very competitive. But actually, we're all, I'd like to think, trying to fight the good fight. We're all on the good side. So actually, is that something where we could do a lot better and, and kind of, work with the media such as yourselves in terms of driving that good news story and driving best practice, talking more, sometimes in an open forum, maybe sometimes, in a private forum, but sharing what's working, not just in terms of big trends and analytics, but just in terms of best practice of working, and also collectively working how the technology vendors work with CISOs and the IT teams, in terms of not just how to sell more tech to them, but how to just make this stuff work better and collaborate more. I think that feels like something that we maybe we don't do as much as we should do.
I think in recent conversations I've had with end user cybersecurity professionals, I feel like sometimes they think it's a bit of an us and them with the vendors. and they're very aware that they're being sold to, which is completely understandable. That's what the vendors are there to do.
Yeah.
But it's having a better understanding of what their problems actually are, because I think sometimes vendors can say, well, there's this problem and we've got this solution, but actually the cybersecurity teams in whatever company are like, oh, is that another problem? I've already got a list of 10. So I think that collaboration point is really, really crucial. And I think that's where events do step in. Infosecurity Europe obviously is a real key one, to have those collaborative talks where hopefully vendors and cybersecurity professionals can work together to understand what the problems actually are. Because one of the problems we always hear about is the skills gap. Like, we always hear about that. That is over and over again one of the main challenges. So understanding those kind of issues, not just what your product is built for, but also, okay, well, how does that work with these problems that they have, is really crucial. And I think it is about making that collaborative effort between those two kind of sides of the coin, so they're not necessarily facing away from each other all the time, is really vital, I think, going forward. And as you said, it's a really busy, saturated market. There is so much competition. So from my side, obviously, I'm getting vendors speaking to me all the time, emailing me. My inbox is quite busy, and if I don't get back to you, it's not nothing personal, but they're competing for space in the media, they're competing for the ears of the CISOs. So you really need to think about, okay, well, how can I stand out and actually solve someone's problem rather than adding to it? And how do my tools fit within the current landscape, for sure?
Yeah, definitely. I want to pick up on something you kind of mentioned there as well, around the skills gap that we do talk about a lot, and kind of STEM and within schools, and kind of what I see with my kids at school, and kind of how exciting kind of IT necessarily could come into. I suppose the thing you talk about of actually as well, there's I don't want to say it's a responsibility, because that sounds like I'm putting it on you, but how collectively as a community we want to talk about, again, cybersecurity in a more positive way and not always too technical, because we want to make sure that we don't just recruit the same sort of people into the industry. I love working in cyber because it is exciting and it's dynamic and stuff is changing and you feel like you're hopefully doing a good thing. But we want to make sure we're attracting as broad a range of people as possible. And it's not just technical, and it's not just complex, and it's not just negative. So I suppose in terms of that skill gap, how we all talk about it is really important as well, in terms of getting a wider range and more people wanting to come in and work in the industry.
Yeah, so we are covering the skills gap all the time, and the ISC2 State of the Workforce report is always a good indicator of where we are. And last year they highlighted that skills gap globally is now at 4 million people, which is a crazy amount. I think it was up. Yeah, and I think it was up about 12% on 2022's figures. So it's growing. I don't necessarily think that people aren't attracted to working in cyber. One of the big issues I think there is, and this is what I've heard discussed within the industry, is that entry-level jobs are really hard to find, because there's a lot of pressure on organizations to get a good cybersecurity team in place, and having the ability to take a risk with someone that hasn't got a lot of experience is obviously quite big. And finding those entry-level jobs, you might have just done a master's, but if you're looking at jobs that are requiring you to have 5 years experience, and obviously there's always the jokes about having 10 years experience in something that's only been in existence for 5 years, that always happens. So I think really thinking about, okay, how can we welcome people that are already interested, that have looked at the Infosecurity Magazine website and not been totally put off by what we're reporting on, and how can we get those young people to join us? Because I think that is one of the big missing points from what I've heard in discussion is, right, I've got all these great kids that I've mentored, but we're looking for an entry-level position for them and they just don't exist. Everyone has got a gap, but it's for someone more senior or someone with more experience. So I definitely encourage people to take a chance on entry-level people, because you might be surprised.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I think that's a great point. I think it does require bravery, and I think in challenging economic times, people always kind of want to play a safe bet. But actually, yeah, having people coming in with a fresh approach, I think, in all industries always can definitely help. So one of the things we kind of wanted to cover was kind of taking a bit more of a deep dive into, kind of when breaches happen, when attacks happen, and it kind of gets reported. So it'd be interesting to kind of, to understand the timeline of when you guys hear. Now, you mentioned obviously kind of compliance and legislation, and obviously if people need to, kind of submit and they need to tell the ICO that something happened, that can kind of kick things off. But kind of how often, where's the point at which you guys kind of necessarily kind of hear about it, that you get engaged? And I suppose the different processes, because you're going to start engaging with different stakeholders. There's going to be technical, but I imagine there's PR and then there's legal. So can you talk us through either kind of what it typically might be, or a couple of examples in terms of kind of what that the news cycle looks like, from a breach?
Yeah, so obviously, if a breach has to be disclosed and reported, that's a really good source for us. Sometimes a company will also make a statement themselves, because what they want to do is make their customers aware that something's happened. So that will sometimes publicly go out. Sometimes that will be a message that goes direct to their customers, though. But if you've got thousands and thousands of customers, often that will then get posted. So those are kind of some of the first points of contact. We will try and reach out to the companies, but I think the Royal Mail example was really good in terms of how the media should approach these attacks, because what we found was they're most of the time they're not going to really have much to add. So we do pick and choose when we reach out to the company that has been the victim of a breach, because really, are they going to say anything other than what's already publicly available? They might have a standard comment to add, but that's fine. We completely understand that. So it's then kind of understanding, okay, from the information that we do have, what can we glean from that? Is there any other experts within the industry that can provide comment? There's a few people that often do.
Yeah.
And we try and make sure it is as neutral as possible, as well. As I said earlier, the email security vendor might say, well, if
Yeah.
they had this in place, but we do try and make sure that we're not relying on those types of comments too much. And as I said, so we'll cover the initial breach and then really look into like why it happened if we can. A lot of the time the information is minimal, and you can kind of understand why a company would take that approach. So it's kind of how to make the story applicable to our audience, with the information that we have available, and not speculating too much, because that can kind of come into play with some of the commentary, like on social media, for example, because you are given quite little information until maybe a few weeks later, when they're like, right, we've done an incident report about this. One really good recent example that was a really interesting story to dive into, that my colleague Kevin covered, was recently Mandiant had their Twitter account taken over. So everyone knows Mandiant as the threat analyst company that works within Google Cloud. So when their account started sending out tweets about crypto currency, it was a bit like, okay, that's happened. How's that happened? I think cybersecurity companies, when an incident does happen, are really good at sharing information after they've dealt with it. I think as a bit of, they've got to have a gold standard in terms of that. Else, if they're not dealing with it well, it's off-putting for customers. But so we didn't actually cover the initial tweet, because it was just like, this is a tweet, and then obviously everyone was piling in on social media. But once they released their report and investigation into what actually happened, and it was an issue with the two-factor authentication, and their account was hijacked, and they had a lot more detail to offer, we did actually wait and cover it then, because we knew that all we had at the beginning was, there's a tweet that doesn't look quite right. Okay, it goes back to that, so what?
Yes.
You could find that on social media anyway. So we did coverage along the fallout of what they had found in their report, which was really interesting, and also linked to some other incidents that have happened. So the SEC was also targeted by a similar kind of crypto campaign. So it's looking at the bigger picture rather than focusing too narrowly on the actual incident, but that's coming from Infosecurity Magazine, which our audience is cybersecurity
Yeah.
professionals. Whereas if you're, as I said, like the BBC or the Guardian, you're going to take a different approach to these things, especially the big ransomware or cyber attacks. The British Library, Royal Mail,
Yeah.
they all hit the headline news, but they're not giving quite as much detail in terms of analysis in some cases.
Yeah, I think the British Library, if I remember right, it was an interesting one. And well, I think I've read quite a bit, and obviously, yeah, in mainstream media because it's been going on a long time as well. But that was one of those examples, if I remember rightly, was that they never said it was a cyber attack at the start. There's
Yeah.
been an IT incident, shall we say? So that's an
Yeah.
interesting one for you guys because I suppose you talk to people within the industry to work out is has a data center just gone down, or actually have they been
Yeah.
compromised? Say,
That's definitely another one we consider. We do take a look at the information we get from other people within the industry. So sometimes if it's quiet, you're like, okay, is this incident just sounds like someone unplugged something they shouldn't have or something like that. I think a good example of that actually that kind of took the world by storm late last year was the FAA in the US, and some of their systems went down and people were like, oh, is it a cyber attack? And it wasn't. It was just someone had overridden something, or it was a technical error. So you do have to kind of skirt a fine line between that, in terms of, is it actually a cyber attack? Is it just a technical IT issue? Because, for example, when your phone stops working, it's not necessarily a cyber attack. Something might have just gone wrong with the update or something.
yeah.
So there is that to consider, and we can kind of, I don't know if there's any kind of magic involved, but sometimes you can kind of just get a feel for what it is and ask around and get people's opinions, for sure. But
Yeah.
the British Library one is really interesting because it's a big brand, I guess, that's
Yeah.
been affected for quite a long time. They've been quite open with their communication about it, and it was recently as recently as this week they actually started to say some of their catalogues were back online. Very good example of a institution that clearly hasn't paid the ransom either, because
Yeah.
they've been affected for quite a number of months, and that's a story that will continue, I think, as they continue to work through this. So it's a very good example of a long time of coverage with
Yeah.
milestones along the way, which we can definitely learn from.
Yeah, and are you seeing organisations kind of seeing, because obviously, stuff happens, things go wrong, it happens it can happen to any organisation. Are they seeing that opportunity to actually maybe be a little bit more open as a way of actually being, as being not just responsible, but actually good PR? That if they talk through it, they explain, they do the reports after, they engage more with yourselves, that they can turn it round from being a more of a PR disaster to actually something that is a little bit more positive in terms of how they responded.
I think you will be judged on how you respond. If you batten down the hatches and are very difficult in terms of your communication, that can be a bad story in itself. If you take a long time to disclose information,
Yeah.
that's obviously a bad story. But each organization is going to have a different way of approaching things and different priorities in terms of how they deal with this. I would say, going back to the example of obviously Mandiant talking about what happened with their crypto hijack. I know we've had breaches relating to LastPass and Okta were two, where they give quite a lot of information out, and that I would imagine is because they are within the industry. They're companies that have interest in cybersecurity anyway. I think
Yeah.
when they're really open, that's a really good example of being transparent, talking about it. At
Yeah.
Infosecurity Europe last year, I think Kevin interviewed the CISO for LastPass, and he talked about the incident. And I think when you can get those people in front of issues and talking about it, I think a lot of other organizations and industries can look up to them and think, okay, bad things happened, but actually people
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
want a bit of an explanation and want to also learn from it themselves. I think that's a key thing. And I'm sure outside of the media, there are groups and forums and WhatsApp channels that are private where people are sharing this information. But if you can do it publicly, I think that does make a lot of difference in terms of how people look at you after a breach. If you look
Yeah.
like you've tried not to share information, you've tried to skirt around an issue, you've put blame on someone that's not you, it's quite damaging to you as a brand, and people will remember that.
Yeah, I suppose that's the natural point to ask your perspective on the 23andMe recent breach and their approach to. I think they probably took that latter. I think that, in terms of their response to customers was interesting, should we say?
Yeah, I think what's happened there though is their legal team have got involved, and
Yeah.
as soon as that happens, it is a different story. And so we're talking about how they've been kind of fighting a legal battle now since the breach. Well, it wasn't really a breach, it was the credential stuffing campaign,
Yes.
which left
Yeah.
a lot of customers' data vulnerable. And what they've said is, well, actually, if the customers or users had updated their passwords, etc., this possibly wouldn't have happened. But from their point of view, I think the legal team are now involved, so that's where they're kind of being defensive, and it is unfortunate that that document got leaked that said that. So I can understand why that's happening, but for them, it's not a great response, unfortunately. But I can understand why
Yeah.
they've
Oh,
taken that approach,
yeah, absolutely.
and that's kind of one thing that is difficult is when you get different stakeholders involved, I'd imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's yeah. When you get legal involved and it becomes not so much of a technical thing, I think that's where that changes. And I suppose we kind of touched on compliance and what have you as well. So it'd be interesting to know kind of the level of engagement you get from regulators such as the ICO. Kind of how often and how much do they want to engage with the media such as yourselves? In terms of from a positive way of saying, well, okay, but people need to submit. They've got 72 hours to notify of a breach. All of this legislation around kind of GDPR and everything. But actually, as that kind of regulator and independent role, there is an opportunity for them to kind of get involved from a positive perspective, to remind people of what they need to do, to share best practice. Do they do that? Is that increasing?
Yeah, I mean, we don't get anything directly from them, but I'm sure if we reach out for comment, we will get a response.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't have an issue with reaching out to any of the regulators in terms of understanding either something that's happened or an update they've had or something. But I think the ICO, for example, they have their own like press agenda that they do provide. The NCSC as well, obviously not necessarily a
Yes.
regulator, but they're very good at sharing information and kind of keeping those things that you mentioned in terms of like best practice and what you should be doing at the top of the agenda from their point of view. So yeah, they definitely are there and make a concerted effort to make sure that their message is being reinforced and repeated, whether that's through updates, blogs, reports. And that's really great for us as well, because then we can pick out that information and share it with our audience. So hopefully it gets a wider reach.
Yeah, and also mention they're not trying to sell anything, so
No, no, no,
that
no.
helps. But I think that's definitely been a positivity. That the increased profile of the ICO and things like the launch of the NCSE, kind of wasn't necessarily actually that long ago. I think in terms of raising the profile and I suppose highlighting the seriousness from the government in terms of kind of outreach and education and helping address this issue, I think has been a positive without doubt.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've got CISA in the US, but I do think maybe it is a bit of UK bias, but I do think that NCSC is one of the globally recognized
Yeah.
institutions that is providing a lot of tools, a lot of advice, and a lot of feedback on that cybersecurity issue.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And just on the kind of on the we kind of just touched on the legal side as well. Do you often sometimes are there instances where legal do kind of get involved a little bit more in terms of trying to keep the media away as much as possible? Because we talk about having that level of openness is kind of important, but I'm sure sometimes they're going to want to hide it despite the fact that at some point it is just gonna break out.
I wouldn't say it's been an issue we've really come across, to be honest with you. And sometimes I think it goes back to when you're initially reporting on something, sometimes you'll just get that one line,
Yeah.
yes, we can confirm this has
Yeah.
happened. we're working on it, and then that has been a conscious decision by the organization to say we can only say so much. So that's absolutely fine, and that's something that I think most journalists would be aware of. Whatever industry they're covering, sometimes you are just going to get that one line response because they can or just don't really want to say too much more until they know the facts. I think that was one of the things with the Royal Mail incident. They don't even know all the facts yet. So piling on them and asking them, well, what about this and what about this, isn't necessarily going to get you the answers you want either.
No, absolutely. So in terms of where you see that kind of collectively as an industry, we could, kind of do better in terms of that engagement, that outreach, that more positive messaging, what would you like to see from kind of us collectively within the infosecurity community in terms of having a more positive approach, and also better at sharing what's working, what's best practice, where we're winning, I suppose.
Yeah, so I think one thing is thinking outside of our own bubble a little bit. So thinking about rather than talking peer to peer, talking outside of that. And I think I mentioned earlier, like really good examples of people on mainstream media talking about breaches, talking about incidents, getting that external outside of our cybersecurity world involved and making sure you're communicating it in a way that people will understand, and trying not to come at things with too much of an agenda. I know it's difficult for everyone, and especially if you do sit within a vendor and you've got certain pressures and certain targets and stuff like that to hit, great. But if you can establish yourself as a voice and there are people out there that do a really good job of this, so they're associated with vendors, but actually you would look to them for relatively sound advice or commentary. Coming at it from that approach, I think is really useful and is something that we'll look out for. And again, I go back to that example. If you are with an email security vendor and you say, well, if they had an email security thing, we're probably not going to use that. But if you're with an email security vendor but say, well, actually I've been working in this industry for 25 years and I know this, or I've got this take on something, great, we'll definitely consider like having a chat with you and learning from you. So yeah, it's a balancing act, and I completely understand why people are like, but I need to mention that we do this product. Great, but also if we can build a trusting relationship where we know you're not going to necessarily do that, then that makes it really easy for us to then pick up the phone or send you an email or a message on Twitter and say, hey, what do you think about this? And also saying, oh, actually I don't have anything I can add. That's also fine. And I think also promoting yourself as that kind of thought leader that isn't just necessarily peddling a message is really critical for people that want to make a mark within the industry that are on the vendor side.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the one thing that kind of I think I'm conscious of, and obviously, this is kind of, entirely obviously from my perspective, working in, as we call it, the channel distribution, resellers, MSPs. I think, when the worst thing happens, and an organization gets a breach of the IT team, see something going on and go, oh, well, that's definitely not good. The first people they often pick the phone up to won't necessarily be one of their many technology vendors. It'll be their trusted partner. It'll be their reseller or their MSP. And actually, I think we've all got to do collectively a better job of talking to yourselves, because we're often the first people that they will speak to, and will be a little bit more independent and have that kind of experience, but aren't necessarily as good at kind of self-promotion, if you like, of being as aware, because we don't necessarily have the people or the expertise in working with the media. I think there's a whole community out there that I think kind of collectively we need to kind of get out a little bit more and leverage that that expertise and that experience they have.
Yeah, and I mean, with experiences, it's challenging, because you can't always say, well, I worked with this company because they had a massive data breach. Actually, maybe that company doesn't want you like sharing that. But if you have a trusted partner and you can say, hey, we've overcome this issue now, I'd like to use it as like a case study or an example. We can say, maybe make it a bit more ambiguous who the organization is. That's great. We still want to learn from that. We still want to hear about, okay, you worked with a company in the manufacturing industry that had an issue and this is how you dealt with it. So it's just walking that line and understanding what you can talk about, and as soon as you've understood that, you can probably go towards commenting on things that are happening based on the experience you have. But yeah, it's again, like I said, it's about establishing yourself as not someone that you think has an agenda when you talk
Yeah.
to them, someone that is just someone that's got a lot of great experience, which I know so many people that you work with likely do, as you said.
Yeah, yeah. And then beginning to get to the end and just finishing off. Obviously, you guys as part of not just obviously the magazine, the digital presence, but especially in terms of the events, kind of speaking, kind of working with people who are going to be defining that agenda for those big kind of topic items that are going to be discussed, both in kind of maybe kind of more peer to peer and kind of the kind of like kind of closed events, but also the kind of the more open forums. What are you seeing in terms of those kind of big topic items that kind of collectively we're going to be talking about kind of in this upcoming year?
Okay, so I think it kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning. AI is
Yeah,
going to continue to be a big talking point. Regulation is a huge one. It's a issue for everyone. I think we have supply chain risk as well. I didn't mention that earlier, but that is something that
yes,
everyone's
yeah,
grappling with. And obviously, we've seen a lot of big instances last year. The Move It instance was
yeah,
a reminder that that's still a huge vulnerability, and also the people side of things, training and awareness, and as well as recruitment and retention. I think those are, if I choose five, those are
yeah,
the big things that we're going to be discussing. And I think none of it is necessarily new. It's thinking about, okay, we do have this issue. What is our new approach to it? So really
yeah,
outside the box thinking as well. People are really keen to listen to things that haven't necessarily been brought up before. So if you're thinking, well, I've got a take on that, and I don't know that anyone else is chatting about that,
yeah,
share it, because
yeah.
as I said, nothing's new. It's just we need to look at new approaches to the issues that do continue within our industry.
Yeah, and I think two of the kind of elements that you picked out, especially around kind of that personal kind of training and education and awareness, that for an individual and supply chain. I think that highlights as much as anything else when we talk about trends that might be in specific organization size or type of attacks or verticals. It's not. It is everybody because everybody can get hit. Everybody uses a computer and can click on something, and everybody is in a supply chain at one point or another. So I think that's the most important thing, that there isn't necessarily a particular threat vector or kind of vertical that's going to get targeted. Everybody kind of potentially could be at risk, and therefore everybody needs to take the right approach and learn from best practice and unfortunately from a negative perspective, prepare for the worst.
Yeah, yeah. It's unfortunately it's not if, it's when. I think that's what everyone
Yes,
always
it
says.
is. I feel that we shouldn't necessarily end on a necessarily end on a negative like that. But I think the fact that actually some of the, if we do finish on more of a positive, some of those trends that you're seeing of more openness and engagement from organisations, I think if we talk about that, and the British Library is a good example of that level of openness. Hopefully, we can see that increase this year, because I think the general, that if the response from everyone is positive, that they've taken that right sort of approach and organizations do that, then I think hopefully that will, kind of continue as a trend, and organizations can obviously use the media and use the channel in terms of being able to do better in the future, and also, respond better and improve their PR a little bit from everything, from what happened. So, well, that was a really, really good discussion. I want to thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope some of it's been useful to the people that are listening in.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Well, everybody, thank you very much for listening. Don't forget you can like and subscribe on all the normal channels. And don't forget to listen out for the next episode. Other than that, thank you very much, Beth.
Thank you.